This investigation is sponsored by Magic Spoon. This book, the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage, is one of my favorite grimoires, and that's for three good reasons. The first is that it's literally a step-by-step guide on how to summon your guardian angel, but that's only half the ritual. Your guardian angel is then supposed to instruct you on how to summon the 12 most powerful demons in hell and harness their powers for good. The second reason I love this book is that doing this whole thing successfully requires the most ludicrously complex and time-consuming ritual I've ever heard of. It's genuinely hardcore, and that's not an exaggeration. And the third reason is that this grimoire itself has a pretty mysterious lore, and I'm not just talking about the story that's written in it, which is actually pretty good for a grimoire, but I'm more talking about the rumors surrounding the people who actually attempted the ritual, and particularly the controversial occultist Aleister Crowley, who failed to complete it, and apparently left a portal to hell wide open, which unleashed chaos upon the world until he eventually closed it, or so the legends tell. But what is this grimoire really? Well, it's the tale of a young seeker of truth who traveled to Egypt and came across a mysterious hermit known as Abrumlin the Mage, who taught him a powerful system of magic. And whether or not you believe in the divine or the supernatural, you're guaranteed to find this stuff interesting. Hey fellow seekers, welcome. I'm Mr. Mythos. If you're a fan of strange and ancient mysteries with research so deep, you're guaranteed to fall down the rabbit hole, you're in the right place. I humbly ask you give this video a like and ding the notification bell so you don't miss any of the rare info we'll be digging into every video. And if you love it, don't forget to share it with a friend. But before we dive into this treasure trove of magic, let me tell you about something else that's known for its magical properties to bring you back in time. I recently discovered Magic Spoon cereal, and I swear it transports me back to my childhood. Growing up, I had a serious sweet tooth and I ate cereal all the time, but as I've gotten older, I've been trying to cut back on carbs and sugar and focus on healthier eating. That's why Magic Spoon is genuinely magical for me. In fact, I love their cereal so much that I already ate all the ones they sent me, and they had to send me a brand new shipment just for this video. Out of all their flavors, my personal favorite has to be maple waffle. It tastes just like the cereal I used to eat, but it's good for my diet. There's 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, 4 net grams of carbs, and only 140 calories per serving. It's also keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and low-carb. You can grab a variety pack today by clicking my link and using my promo code MYTHOS at checkout to get $5 off any order, or go to magicspoon.com/mythos. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product that you're backed by a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So click my link and go to magicspoon.com/mythos and use my code MYTHOS to save $5 today. Thanks again to Magic Spoon. Let's dive right into this old grimoire of angelic magic. The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage dates back to the Renaissance period, possibly as old as the 15th century. However, the magical ideas written in it likely derive from hundreds of years earlier, in the late antique period, when many esoteric schools of thought, both Eastern and Western, intermingled and began to spread into Europe. This includes the beliefs and practices of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism. For authors of these type of mystical manuscripts, writing itself was a practice that carried occult or hidden power, and was mostly only done by priest-magicians. Therefore, this book of magic can also be considered as a magical book, imbued with mystical properties. And broadly speaking, that's the definition of a grimoire. So, to unlock its power, you have to read between the lines. As the old saying goes, every word speaks 3. So depending on the translation, the Book of the Sacred Magic is actually made up of 3 to 4 separate books, and the first book is essentially the story of the hero's journey. While the narrative is definitely interesting on its own, don't be fooled by its simplicity. As commanded by the author, a man who calls himself Abraham of Worms, quote, "Thou shalt not neglect the study of this first book," end quote. Book 1 is Abraham's account of the journey he made and the magicians he met in his quest for divine wisdom, which took him from his home in Germany all the way to Egypt, where he eventually found a true master to mentor him, the mysterious hermit by the name of Abrumlin. And by passing his trials, Abraham came to possess Abrumlin's secrets of a practical, very real magic that allowed him to summon his guardian angel. Now, it's common for grimoires to use fictional stories as a framing device to interest the reader, as well as to give context to the occult secrets they contain. But in the case of the Book of the Sacred Magic, this journey undertaken by Abraham might have actually happened. There are certain historical connections we'll make a bit later, but with that in mind, let's jump right in. Our main protagonist, the claimed author of the grimoire, is Abraham, a Jew from the city of Worms in Germany who's believed to have lived somewhere in the 14th and 15th centuries AD. The text dates itself to the year 1458, written by Abraham as an old man. As Abraham had already taught his eldest son the Jewish system of mysticism known as Kabbalah, this entire grimoire and the sacred magic it contains were intended as a gift to his youngest son, Lamech, once Lamech came of age. Contained within, however, was a far more powerful form of Kabbalah than the one he had passed to his eldest son. It's not stated why Abraham made this choice, but certainly it was a calculated one. What sparked Abraham's pursuit of divine truth was ultimately the dying words of his own father. Quote, "My father Simon, shortly before his death, gave me certain signs and instructions concerning the way in which it is necessary to acquire the Holy Kabbalah. After his death, finding myself 20 years of age, I had a very great passion to understand the true mysteries of the Lord." End quote. Having committed to pursue the divine secrets, Abraham soon learned of a well-educated, respected, and very old rabbi named Moses, who was rumored to possess this wisdom. Traveling to the German city of Mainz, he committed himself to Moses' mentorship and teachings for 4 long years. However, while Moses acted with good intentions and was able to demonstrate some magical abilities, his practice of Kabbalah was unfortunately corrupted by pagan and occult ideas. Quote, "In his magic, he did not in any way make use of the wisdom of the Lord, but instead availed himself of certain arts and superstitions of infidel and idolatrous nations, in part derived from the Egyptians, together with images of the Medes and of the Persians, with herbs of the Arabians, together with the power of the stars and the constellations. And finally, he had drawn from every people and nation, and even from the Christians, some diabolical art. And in everything, the spirits blinded him to such an extent, even while obeying him in some ridiculous and inconsequent matter, that he actually believed that his blindness and error were the veritable magic, and therefore pushed no further his research into the true and sacred magic. I remained with him for 4 years, miserably wasting all that time there." End quote. Greatly disappointed at this realization, Abraham decided to leave his former master, but thankfully he didn't find himself completely alone. There was a young man from Bohemia named Samuel who'd also studied in Moses' sect, and Samuel's pursuit of divine truth was just as genuine and passionate as Abraham's. Samuel had been planning a journey to Constantinople to join his uncle in a pilgrimage to his ancestors' Holy Land. This, Abraham felt, was the direction forward, so he decided to accompany him. On the 13th of February in 1397, the two commenced this immense trek, traveling through Germany, Bohemia, and Austria, then to Hungary and Greece, and finally to the city of Constantinople. Together they stayed in Constantinople for 2 years, and these years were apparently fruitful and important ones in Abraham's life, as he writes that he would have never left, if not for a tragic event. Unfortunately, Samuel was struck by a sudden and violent illness and died. With his heart overwhelmed, Abraham felt lost and could no longer stay in this city. So he left, once again, seeking the path of truth through the Middle East. Finally, nearly 10 years since the death of his father, Abraham's feet sunk into the sands of Egypt, where he would spend another year wandering, completely ignorant of the magical master he would soon encounter. Quote, I arrived at a little town called Iraqi, situated on the bank of the Nile, where I lodged with an old Jew named Aaron, where indeed I had already lodged before in my journey. He asked me whether I had found that which I wished. I answered mournfully that I had done absolutely nothing, and I made him an exact recital of the labors and troubles which I had undergone, and my recital was accompanied by my tears, which I could not help shedding in abundance, so that I attracted the compassion of the old man, and he began to try to comfort me by telling me that during my journey he had heard say that in a desert place not far from the aforesaid town of Iraqi dwelt a very learned and pious man whose name was Abrumlin. Aaron found me a guide who conducted me to the nearest route, by which, walking upon fine sand during the space of 3 days and a half without seeing any human habitation, I at length arrived at the foot of a hill of no great height, and which was entirely surrounded by trees. My guide then said, In this small wood dwelleth the man whom you seek. End quote. In this grimoire, we never actually find out much about Abrumlin, with the exception of a few scant details. Living 3.5 days from the nearest town of Iraqi, on a small hill and in a house hidden by trees, it's obvious that Abrumlin was a hermit shunning society, which was a challenging and intensely lonely lifestyle that certain Jews and Christians took on in the past in hopes of removing the distractions and temptations of society, so that they might entirely focus themselves on their relationship with God. It's unknown how long Abrumlin had been out there, living in the middle of nowhere, but when Abraham first saw him appearing out from the thick of the trees, he described him as a venerable aged man. Abrumlin wasn't shocked by Abraham's arrival though, as he was quick to salute and greet him, speaking in Chaldean, the biblical Aramaic language. Abraham must have also been fluent, as language is no barrier between them, and to his extreme pleasure, the old sage immediately invited him into his humble home, as if he already knew what Abraham had come for. Behavior-wise, Abrumlin was as pure and devout as you'd expect. Quote, The good old man was very courteous to me and treated me very kindly, and during an infinitude of days he never spoke to me of any other matter than of the fear of God, exhorting me to lead ever a well-regulated life, and from time to time warned me of certain errors which man commits through human frailty, and further, he made me understand that he detested the acquisition of riches and goods through harm wrought to our neighbor. He required from me a very solemn and precise promise to change my manner of life and to not live according to our false dogmas, but in the way and law of the Lord. End quote. Abraham solemnly swore this promise to Abrumlin, and thus began the master mentorship that would forever change the young seeker's life. Abrumlin retreated into his small dusty library and returned with 2 weathered handwritten manuscripts, instructing his student to copy them by hand. Abraham points out to the reader that the content of these 2 manuscripts make up the second and third books of the grimoire, the Guardian Angel Summoning Ritual and the Magic Word Squares, both of which we'll be exploring in great detail later. However, though the manuscripts were in Abraham's hands, they weren't free of charge. Quote, He asked me if I had any money. I answered unto him, Yes. He said unto me that he required 10 golden florins, which he must himself, according to the order which the Lord had given unto him, distribute by way of alms among 72 poor persons, who were obliged to repeat certain psalms. End quote. So there's a bit to discuss here. First off, the florin was one of the most widely used commercial currencies of the late Middle Ages, used all throughout Europe and beyond, including Egypt. It was a coin made of gold, worth anywhere between 140 to 1,000 modern US dollars. Thankfully, Abraham did have that kind of money on him so that he could receive the sacred knowledge he'd already spent a decade searching for. And speaking of a decade, 10 years, Abrumlin asked for 10 gold coins to distribute among 72 poor persons. In grimoires, the use of numbers is incredibly important to look out for, as numerology is often used to obscure layered meanings to the text. So, beginning with the number 10, In Kabbalah, the Jewish esoteric teachings, 10 is a number of the Sephirot. The Sephirot are the 10 attributes through which God manifests itself and continuously creates the physical and metaphysical realms. These attributes include, for example, wisdom, loving kindness, might, and beauty, as well as other reflections of God's divine emotions, intellect, and nature. The ancient Kabbalists didn't mean for this to imply that God itself could be understood, but simply that these 10 attributes were the distinct ways in which God interacted with its creation. These attributes also interact with one another, as depicted in the famous Tree of Life diagram, where there are clearly illustrated links between them. The Kabbalists use these links to better understand God's way of creation. As for these 72 poor people, you'll find this curious number not only in magical texts, but also in the Bible itself. For example, the 72 races that came from Noah, and the 72 languages resulting from the confusion at the Tower of Babel, both found in the book of Genesis. Even the New Testament, in chapter 10 of the Gospel of Luke, describes 72 disciples sent by Jesus. But in Kabbalistic numerology, 72 has a very specific meaning. 72 is the number of names composing the Shem HaMephoresh, a term which refers to the extended explicit name of God. You may already know that the name of God in the Old Testament is Yahweh, but the idea that Yahweh has an extended name comes from 3 specific verses in chapter 14 of the book of Exodus, verses 19, 20, and 21. Each of these 3 sequential verses contains exactly 72 Hebrew letters, which obviously is a rather strange phenomenon. So by writing the 19th verse right to left in Hebrew, then underneath it writing the 20th verse left to right, and underneath that writing the 21st verse right to left, then finally dividing them into columns of 3 letters each, the end result is 72 Hebrew letter triplets. These are the 72 names, all together forming the extended explicit name of God. Pretty interesting stuff, but without going in any deeper, in a Kabbalistic context, the 10 gold florin coins represent the attributes of God, and the 72 poor people represent the name of God. Finally, it's also worth noting that Abrumlin requests the poor people to repeat certain psalms, and though the exact verses are not specified, Kabbalists believe that specific verses of psalms explain each of the 72 names of God, so those verses are probably the ones being recited. Anyways, returning to the story, as Abrumlin traveled to the town of Veraki to distribute the money, Abraham was given a challenge to prove his devotion, and a vague but vital warning not to make even a single mistake. Quote, "He ordered me to fast for 3 days, contenting myself with only a single meal in the day, wherein was to be neither blood nor dead things. Also he commanded me to make this commencement with exactness, and not to fail in the least thing. For in order to operate well, it is very necessary to begin well, and he instructed me to repeat all of the 7 Psalms of David, one single time in these 3 days, and I faithfully obeyed him." End quote. The importance of absolute perfection and lack of mistakes is arguably a vital requirement of the angel summoning ritual later on, by the way. So, 15 days after his departure, Abrumlin returned to his hermitage, and pleased with Abraham's success with the challenge and his completed copies of the 2 manuscripts, he gave the young seeker one final instruction. He asked Abraham to wake up the next morning, before sunrise, to make a humble and devoted confession of his life unto God, with a firm commitment to serve and fear God, and live and die by his holy law with complete obedience. The next morning, Abraham performed this task without fault, beginning before the sun had risen and ending once the sun had completely set. With this, the young seeker was finally ready to receive the sacred magic. In the morning that followed, Abrumlin met Abraham with a great smile. He led him into his hermitage, then into his library, where he placed the 2 small manuscripts Abraham had copied into his hands. Abramelin then asked if Abraham truly, and without fear, wished for the divine science and for the true magic. Abraham answered that obtaining the divine science and the true magic was quite literally the only reason why he'd taken this arduous 10-year journey in the first place, wrought with misguidance, trouble, and terrible loss. Basically, Abraham said yes. So it was time for the old mage to bestow upon his student his blessing, guidance, and a final warning. Quote, "And I," said Abramelin, "trusting in the mercy of the Lord, I grant and accord unto thee this holy science, which thou must acquire in the manner which is prescribed unto thee in the 2 little manuscript books, without omitting the least imaginable thing of their contents, and not in any way to gloss or comment upon that which may be or may not be, seeing that the artist who hath made that work is the same God who from nothingness hath created all things. Thou shalt in no way use this sacred science to offend the great God, and to work ill unto thy neighbor. Thou shalt communicate it unto no living person whom thou dost not thoroughly know by long practice in conversation, examining well whether such a person really intendeth to work for the good or for the evil." End quote. Having finally received this treasure, Abraham tried to throw himself to the ground and bow, only for Abramelin to remind him that one should only bend the knee before God. Abraham would then remain in the same hermitage for some time, reading and studying the manuscripts and asking his mentor for explanations and guidance when the material was difficult or confusing. And finally, having a complete understanding of the books and ritual, Abraham departed from Abramelin the mage, never to see him again. After telling the story to his son Lamech of how he came to learn this sacred magic, Abraham proceeds to reflect in great detail on those 10 disappointing years he spent searching, so that Lamech would not make the same mistakes. Abraham had met many so-called masters, either self-proclaimed or believed to be holy by their community, from misguided wise men like the Rabbi Moses to a band of actual murderous witches, and even a devil-worshipping Bohemian who exercised evil powers not for violence, but simply to fool and enrapture the public. Quote, "That impious Bohemian performed astounding feats. He rendered himself invisible. He used to fly in the air. He used to enter through keyholes in locked-up rooms. He knew our greatest secrets, and once he told me things which God alone could know. But his art cost him too dear, for the devil had made him swear in the pact that he would use all his secrets to the dishonor of God. Ultimately, his body was found dragged through the streets, and his head without any tongue therein, lying in a drain. And this was all the profit he drew from his diabolical science and magic. Let that miserable Bohemian and the others who I have before mentioned serve thee for an example to avoid." End quote. After his long journey back from Egypt, Abraham finally arrives safely at his home in Worms, Germany. Here he states that the only thing that remained was for him to actually practice the sacred magic and summon his holy guardian angel by performing a very specific ritual, today commonly referred to as the Abramelin operation. However, Abraham had been gone for a very long time, and as you might imagine, there were a number of important things to take care of, as well as the distractions of everyday life, the greatest hindrance of which Abraham states was his marriage to his loving and very pregnant wife. So Abraham had to rethink his ambitions. While he briefly entertained the idea of going off to live in the forest, he ultimately decided to remain in the house with his wife and their servant. And in this home, he would go through great lengths to avoid them and somehow live a life of almost uninterrupted solitude from them and from the outside world for a rather long period of time. The most accurate translation of the grimoire states the ritual period as 18 months. In the grimoire, Abraham describes these months as extremely difficult and often depressing. However, he completed the holy operation with all details considered, all requirements fulfilled, and not a single mistake made. Upon the end of these 18 months, quote, "While I was making my prayer unto him, he deigned to grant unto me the vision and apparition of his holy angels, together with which I experienced so great joy, consolation, and contentment of the soul, that I could neither express it nor put it into writing." End quote. Abraham met his holy guardian angel, and the angel's apparition lasted 3 days, during which he was advised and instructed on how to enslave the evil spirits. By the way, one very notable aspect of the Abrumlin operation is that it's only half complete once the guardian angel is summoned. After this, the practitioner needs to summon the 12 kings and dukes of hell, and bind them to their will. We'll be getting into all that real soon. The end result was profound, though. Abraham spends the rest of the first book describing the many real and important historical figures who he helped with his newfound powers, which included the ability to heal and prophesize. Quote, "Up till now I have healed persons of all conditions, bewitched unto death, no less than 8,413, and belonging unto all religions, without making an exception in any case." End quote. More than this, it can't be overstated as to the sheer power that he gained from the operation, as he also demonstrated the ability to control the actions of people. Abraham recounts, quote, "At the time when I was lodged at the house of the Duke of Bavaria, the door of my room was forced, and I had the value of 83,000 Hungarian pieces stolen from me in jewels and money. As soon as I returned, the thief was forced to himself bring it back to me in person, and to return with his own hands to me the money, jewels, and account books, and to give me the principal reasons which had forced him to commit the theft." End quote. Finally, Abraham states that he only ever used his powers for the glory of God and for helping others, from friends to enemies, those pious and those pagan, and even plants and animals. He warns the reader that because the magic in this book is extraordinarily powerful, it should never be used for evil. So, with that, let's dive right into the second book of the grimoire, the details of the Abrumlin operation and how we should go about summoning our holy guardian angel. The second book within this grimoire provides full detail and instructions to the reader of a powerful and extreme Kabbalistic magical ritual, with the goal to achieve what modern occultists abbreviate as KNC-HGA, or Knowledge and Conversation of your Holy Guardian Angel. This meeting and exchange with your guardian angel will then give you the ability and proper guidance to summon and enslave a host of hell's most powerful demons, who, once you have control over them, these demons will fulfill all of your righteous desires. So, in essence, the Abrumlin operation is actually 2 distinct rituals. First we handle the angel, then we tackle the demons. This particular aspect makes this grimoire very unique because it really is questionable whether you can call this Kabbalistic magic, as demon summoning and enslaving is more in the territory of what's known as goetic magic. Goetic magic, or goetia, is a magical practice that sometimes involves the summoning of angels, but it's usually all about the demons. This occult science largely derives from the Lesser Key of Solomon, a 17th century grimoire which instructs the reader on how to summon 72 demons. The roots of goetic magic are actually quite ancient though, far older than the 17th century. Likewise, the Abrumlin operation is believed to be based on truly ancient rituals. Regardless, the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage is still an odd one in both the Kabbalistic and Goetic worlds, simply because of the unique process it presents of summoning a holy angel in order to summon demons, demons who then work for the magician, who technically works for the angel, who, of course, works for God. And if you think that's confusing, just wait until we get into the requirements of the ritual. It's an understatement to say that these requirements are elaborate and difficult. Every single detail is meticulously provided, from the qualifications necessary to become a magician, to selecting an appropriate location, what to wear, and even how often to take a shower. And of course, it's more than just demanding in the details. It's a serious dedication of time. When you imagine a magic ritual, you might think a few hours past midnight, not really much of a big deal. However, the most authoritative copies of this text state that the operation takes an entire 18 months for a person to meet their holy guardian angel, and that's not even including the demon summoning phase. That's 18 months of solitude, away from family and society, 18 months of asceticism, putting a hard pause on all worldly pleasures to focus entirely on the ritual and on God. This is why so few people have claimed to have actually completed the Abrumlin operation. Most people simply don't have the freedom, let alone the determination. However, the ones who did complete it are adamant that it worked. Alright, so diving right in, we're met with a number of prerequisites if a person wishes to become a magician and carry out the operation. These include the following. You must have discipline and self-restraint, and a willingness to embrace a life of solitude. You must not be greedy for wealth and material things, and never lend money to others at unreasonably high rates of interest. You must be of good health, and between the ages of 25 and 50 years old. You must also be monotheistic, meaning that you can be of any religion so long as you believe there is only one God. You must be willing to shun the literature and teachings of all other systems of magic while performing the operation. You must avoid choosing any particular month, day, or time to begin the ritual, as a person might perceive it as lucky or special. Finally, there is also a prerequisite that's unfortunately rather sexist, in that women generally aren't supposed to perform the ritual. As written by Abraham, quote, "Among women, there be only virgins who are suitable. But I strongly advise that so important a matter should not be communicated to them, because of the accidents that they might cause by their curiosity and love of talk." End quote. We should note that while the grimoire itself seems to stress the idea of exactitude and perfection, and that the instructions it gives must be followed extremely carefully, there's a long history of practitioners who interpreted these prerequisites as general guidelines more than strict rules. In fact, even though Abraham tells us not to choose a particular day to begin, he himself starts the operation the day after the Jewish holiday of Passover. So it's up to you to decide whether or not the words of Abraham are the law of the Abrumlin operation, or if we might have some flexibility, or not. Next, there are certain things that the magician must gather for the ritual, which include the following: an altar, a bedroom, a prayer room with a window and a balcony, perfume for the prayer room and the bedroom, made from a fragrant wood, a vest and white tunic made of linen, a white girdle made of silk, a knee-length crimson robe made of silk and golden threads, a robe of mourning, which most people interpret as meaning a black robe, a pure white veil that covers the whole face, and on it is written the Tetragrammaton, better known as the name of God, Yahweh, a crown, a wand made from the wood of an almond tree, a square or seven-sided plate of silver, a lamp filled with olive oil to be hung from the ceiling, a specific ceremonial oil, today referred to as Abrumlin oil, made from ingredients that vary depending on the translation, a specific incense, today referred to as Abrumlin incense, whose ingredients also vary depending on the translation. We also need a censer, which is a container used to house and burn the incense, and make note that this must never be taken out of the prayer room. And finally, we need a basket made of copper, which is then filled with the charcoal used to light the inside of the censer. Note that after every prayer session, any ashes created from the coals and the incense need to be taken out and buried in the garden. Oh yeah, an outdoor garden is also suggested, but as to what is technically required, Abraham describes it as, quote, "a place which cannot well be made unclean, such as a garden." End quote. To be honest, this is sort of like a riddle because other than a garden, I can't really think of a place that cannot be made unclean. But you all are pretty smart and creative, so if you can think of a place besides a garden that cannot be made unclean, pause the video and let me know in the comments. I'd love to know your answers. Anyway, that covers the requirements for the most part. My breakdown here is just to give you a general idea, so if you're intent on performing the operation, the book of course has the details you need, just be wary of the translation. Moving on, we've got what we need, and it's now time to begin the first part of the ritual, the 18 months required for your holy guardian angel to appear. These 18 months are broken into 3 distinct phases: lifestyle change, complete seclusion, and absolute focus. Only after these 3 phases are completed can the magician finally invoke and meet their holy guardian angel. Phase 1, which I described as lifestyle change, requires the magician to reprogram their habits and behaviors. For example, refusing alcoholic beverages and being restrictive in what and how much you eat. Additionally, a specific weekly routine must be adhered to, such as making sure to perfume one's bedsheets on the Sabbath, which is Saturday for Jews and Sunday for Christians. Beyond these dramatic lifestyle changes, and undoubtedly more important, the magician also needs to make prayer a center of their daily agenda, including a lengthy prayer session before sunrise and another at sunset. By the way, if you're part of the camp that believes the instructions must be followed exactly and without exception, God forbid if you mess up at any point in these 18 months, for example by forgetting to change your sheets on the eve of the Sabbath, or accidentally taking a bath on a Wednesday, or your wife entering your bedchamber while she's on her period, which is an actual rule by the way. You need to start over from day 1. So be careful. Also, it's worth mentioning that even though you're living in solitude, you're permitted to sleep in the same bed as your wife, so long as she's clean and not in that phase of her monthly cycle. But there's a catch. Quote, "During the following 4 moons, ye shall flee sexual intercourse, as ye would the plague." End quote. Since I'm quoting from the Mather's translation, in a more accurate translation, it might actually be more than the first 4 moons, or 4 months, and chastity is pretty important here, so be careful not to do that. The second phase of the 18 months is thankfully rather straightforward, as is based on the new habits and routines we've already established, and essentially just pushes them to more extreme lengths. As Abraham instructs, quote, "As to what regardeth commerce and manner of living, I have already given unto you sufficient instruction, only it is absolutely necessary to retire from the world and seek retreat." End quote. So we need to embrace complete seclusion, but that's not all. There's also the introduction of taking a very thorough shower and fasting on the eve of the Sabbath. Also, there are some changes to our prayer sessions. Before entering the prayer room, you now need to wash your hands and face thoroughly with purified water, which is pretty easy to do. However, with great emphasis, Abraham instructs the magician, quote, "You shall prolong your prayer with the greatest possible affection, devotion, and submission. Ye shall lengthen your prayers to the utmost of your ability." End quote. So we can assume that most of our time not spent showering and fasting will now be spent in the prayer room. The third phase of the 18-month operation pushes the practitioner to the very edge of their ability and truly tests their commitment, as the magician is required to devote their entire mind to the Abrumlan text and rituals, shun society entirely except for their wife, speaking with her only of the law of God, and discard almost all other aspects of life, with the sole exception being acts of charity to one's neighbor. With this, the ultimate goal will finally have been achieved, and that's for the practitioner to have fully embraced a pure life, clean in body, mind, and spirit, and thus worthy enough that God might bless us with, quote, "this particular grace, which is that you may enjoy and be able to endure the presence and conversation of his holy angels, and by their intermission, grant unto you the secret wisdom, so that you may be able to have dominion over the evil spirits and over all creatures." End quote. That's certainly the end goal of the 18 months, to learn from our guardian angel how to dominate the demons we're about to summon. By the way, that quote was taken from a new prayer that we must now include in our prayer sessions, and in Phase 3, These lengthy prayer sessions that extend to your absolute maximum ability to pray are now ramped up to 3 times a day: morning, noon, and evening. Also, you now need to make sure to wear the vest and tunic made of linen every time you enter the prayer room, and remember to end every one of these sessions with a prayer not to God, but to the holy angels themselves for their assistance, as the path gets remarkably more dangerous from here. So we've reached the final days of the 18 months of preparation, and proven our purity and worthiness to connect with our guardian angel. The last 3 days are to be spent worshiping God and the guardian angels with every bit of energy and attention in our body, and if all has been done according to the instructions, your holy guardian angel is said to finally enter the prayer room. They aren't yet visible, but you'll know they're there because you'll feel their incredible power in your bones, and according to Abraham, you'll also smell them. Quote, "For then it is that you will begin to inflame yourself in praying, and you will see appear an extraordinary and supernatural splendor, which will fill the whole apartment, and will surround you with an inexpressible odor." End quote. It isn't long after this that your holy guardian angel will literally manifest before your very eyes, and Abraham tells us exactly what to expect. Quote, "You shall see your guardian angel appear unto you in unequaled beauty, who also will converse with you and speak in words so full of affection and of goodness, and with such sweetness that no human tongue could express the same. He will animate you unto your great content in the fear of God, making you a recital of the blessings which you have received from God, and bringing unto you your remembrance of the sins by which you have offended him during the whole period of your life, and will instruct you and give unto you the manner in which you shall be able to appease him. After this he will show unto you the true wisdom and holy magic, and also wherein you have erred in your operation, and how thenceforward you should proceed in order to overcome the evil spirits, and finally arrive at your desired ends. He will promise never to abandon you, but to defend and assist you during the whole period of your life, on the condition that you shall obey his commands, and that you shall not voluntarily offend your Creator. In one word, you shall be received by him with such affection that this description which I here give unto you shall appear a mere nothing in comparison." End quote. So, that's a lot to pack in, but there is something subtle that I want to point out, and maybe you caught it, but Abraham wrote that the angel will inform you of where you erred or made mistakes during the operation, which implies that it doesn't have to be completely perfect. So maybe the rumors aren't true that you have to restart from the beginning if you take a shower on Wednesday. Regardless, I'd do my best not to put their mercy to the test in the first place. The most important aspect in this current stage of the Abrumlin operation, though, and one that the magician needs to carefully pay attention to, undistracted by the angel's sheer splendor, is their guardian angel's practical advice on how to defeat evil. Quote, "The rest of the day you shall remain therein, receiving from the holy angel distinct and ample information regarding the evil spirits and the manner of bringing them into submission, carefully writing down and taking notes of all these matters." End quote. You'd be wise not to gloss over this step, because what notes you've made are about to become your lifeline, as the instructions of the grimoire itself will not be able to protect you from the diabolic dangers you're about to face. Though the demon summoning phase of the Abrumlin operation is described very literally, there is a great metaphor at play. If the first half of the operation was about embracing all that is pure, the second half is about conquering that which is corruptive. So by summoning and dominating the evilest of evil spirits, the magician gains full command over their influence, and thus control in his own mind of the negative thoughts, impulses, feelings, and desires all humans are confronted with. That being said, the practices and results here are written in an extremely literal sense. Just like the physical manifestation of the holy guardian angel who comes from heaven, the 12 kings and dukes of hell are supposed to be real independent entities from hell itself. Archdemons that are incredibly clever and nothing short of extremely dangerous. While your guardian angel's advice is definitely what you should follow, you can be completely sure of one thing. These demons will try to trick you at every angle. You can expect them to attempt to bargain with you and strike a deal, betting on your greed, lust, and other sinful impulses. They may demand a sacrifice or promise from you, and when that doesn't work, they'll become more aggressive. The demons might name the worst sins you ever committed in embarrassing detail to break your spirit and make you doubt yourself. And generally speaking, they'll do everything they can to make you think that your faith is false and completely useless. That being said, your best defense against them is your faith. Quote, "Evil can know the secrets of your heart. They can penetrate into and understand that which you are thinking by means of your actions and your words. The evil spirits be about you, though invisible, and they keenly examine whether he who conjureth them is courageous or timid, whether he is prudent, and whether he hath a true faith in God. We can constrain the evil spirits and force them to appear, but a few words ill pronounced will produce an effect against the person himself who ignorantly pronounceth them." End quote. So, while slipping up during the 18-month ritual may be forgiven, or at worst, force you to restart from the beginning, if you mess up during this demon summoning ritual, it's believed they won't hesitate to attack or possess you. You may be driven completely insane. They might even kill you. Thankfully, this part of the ritual only lasts 3 days, but all these pitfalls must be carefully considered before beginning the conjuration. So, what are we up against here exactly? Who are the 4 superior princes and 8 sub-princes, as written by Abraham? Well, today, this fear-worthy group of archdemons are popularly known as the 12 kings and dukes of hell. According to this particular version of hell's hierarchy, there are 8 dukes and 4 kings. The dukes, of course, are lesser than the kings. The 8 dukes of hell's identities are as follows: Astaroth, who teaches witchcraft and other dark magical arts; Magoth, who encourages overindulgence; Asmodeus, a regular antagonist in Judeo-Islamic lore, who usually represents lust; Beelzebub, the so-called Lord of the Flies, who's associated with disease; Orions, the ruler of the East Cardinal Direction, who can see into the past and the future; Paimon, a masterful teacher of science and the secrets of the world's operation, and who is often described as having a beautiful face, wearing a crown, and riding on a camel; Ariton, who has elemental command over water, and who has an appearance so frightening that the practitioner must avoid looking directly at him or risk suffering a fatal seizure. And finally, there is Amaimon, the ruler of the South Cardinal Direction, whose deadly poisonous breath can only be avoided by wearing a blessed silver ring on one's middle finger, according to the grimoire The Lesser Key of Solomon. Now, while most of these 8 dukes are definitely recognizable to most occultists, most of the 4 kings are household names in the Western Hemisphere. The 4 kings of hell are Lucifer, Leviathan, Satan, and Belial. Yes, the magician will be summoning the devil himself. If you're wondering about the difference between Lucifer and Satan, that depends on who you ask, but generally occultists see them as 2 sides of the same coin, with Lucifer representing vanity and rebellion, and Satan representing confrontation and temptation. And to add to this point, the other 2 kings, Leviathan and Belial, are also often equated with the devil, with Leviathan representing chaos and envy, and Belial associated with lies and lust. All of these descriptions are obviously oversimplified, and I expect some of you to disagree, since that's just one interpretation. In fact, some grimoires seem to describe all 4 as entirely separate demonic entities, but that's a story for another day. Abrumlin gives the following instructions, which must be repeated over the course of the 3-day ritual. Quote, "Firstly, you should perform the conjuration in your mother tongue, and conjure the spirits, rehearsing unto them examples of their ruin and fall, of the sentence which God hath pronounced against them, and of their obligation unto servitude. Also, you shall menace them, in case they are unwilling to obey, with calling unto your aid the power of the holy angels over them. And in case of their being inclined to resist, and unwilling to obey you, you must not give way to anger, because this will only do injury to yourself, that being exactly what they would be endeavoring to do. But, putting your whole trust in God, with a tranquil heart you shall exhort them to yield, letting them see that you have put all your confidence in the living and only God, reminding them how powerful and potent He is, and communicate unto them also the form in which you wish them to appear, the form suggested by your guardian angel, who knoweth better than you your nature and constitution, and who understandeth the forms which can terrify you, and those of which you can support the sight. Observing then the doctrine that your angel will have given unto you, and persevering in placing all your trust in God, at length they will appear in the form commanded upon the terrace, upon the sand." End quote. The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage does give pretty detailed instructions of what to do and what to avoid during the 3-day process. For example, the magician needs to fast for the entire duration. But as for handling evil, as you might expect, most of it has to do with invoking the name and might of God to spiritually beat the archdemons into submission. And of course, following the instructions of your guardian angel, as they know best. So, without complicating things, I'll give you my summary. On the first day, the magician is instructed to summon the 4 kings of hell and demand an oath of servitude from them. Assuming that this went well, the second day should be easier, as the magician is to command the 4 kings to summon the 8 dukes into the room, who the magician will again demand them to swear their complete allegiance. Finally, on the third day, the magician is tasked with summoning the 8 dukes directly, commanding the dukes to bring with them the armies of lesser demons they control. Though the dukes will be visible, the lesser demons who serve them will remain invisible. But you'll definitely feel their presence in the room, as they'll be all around you. Finally, Abraham gives us a few pieces of practical advice on how to treat the demons you've recently enslaved. Quote, "You shall not be too rude and insulting in commanding them, or your angel may instruct you not to be so rigid and severe with them. If they should appear with tumult and insolence, only show them the consecrated wand, and if they continue to make a disturbance, smite upon the altar twice or thrice. After summoning, it is not necessary to send away the spirits, because they themselves are only too glad to be far away from you." End quote. So finally, by the grace of God and our holy guardian angel, we find ourselves in full control over the 12 kings and dukes of hell. It was a lot of effort, but the power obtained should be more than worth it. That brings us to the question, what can we actually accomplish using their demonic supernatural abilities? Well, the most famous demon-summoning goetic grimoires describe a vast range of potential for the brave soul who successfully enslaves a demon or archdemon. Some of the most common powers include granting the practitioner abilities such as flight or invisibility. They might also cast love spells, or, my personal favorite, help the magician find buried treasure. And mark my words, one of these days I'll make a video on treasure hunting with demons. That being said, the question of what specific powers the 12 kings and dukes of hell have to offer the magician leads us to the third book of the grimoire, and arguably the most convoluted book of them all. As you can see, this final section of the book contains a vast number of cryptic letter puzzles, better known as magic squares. These magic squares are talismans, meaning that each one has been imbued with sacred magic. The puzzles themselves must be solved in order to activate the magic, which we now understand is largely powered by demons. They also must be solved only after the magician successfully completes the Abrumlin operation, otherwise they simply won't work. The demonic powers the magician can take advantage of are clearly listed, and each one is specific to its own magic square. As expected, there's a lot of standard spells, such as those to heal illnesses, tell the future, read minds, acquire vast riches, make the practitioner appear young or old or even of the opposite gender, and even turn men into donkeys. However, there's a strong emphasis on only using this magic for the good of humanity. What's rather strange though, is that despite stressing that this magic should never be used for evil purposes, Abraham still includes a number of spells that can easily be considered black magic. For example, spells to bewitch people, to target vital organs, to destroy entire towns, and even cause wars. In most other grimoires, magic squares are composed of numbers, which makes Abrumlin squares rather unique as they contain letters. And as you might have guessed, they function very similarly to a word search. Hidden within each magic square is a written spell, containing words related to the magical goal, as well as the names of the specific spirits bound to the magic square. And by the way, these squares were meticulously designed, and their words carefully hidden. It's really no question that these magic squares are far more complex than your average word search. The most common ways words are embedded in the squares include palindromes, which is a word that reads the same both forward and backward, and acrostics, which is a word that reads the same both forward and downward. Moving up in complexity, there's a type of word called a double acrostic, which is essentially the opposite of an acrostic because this word reads differently forward and downward. Then there's a perfect double acrostic, a word that reads exactly the same forward, downward, backward, and upward. Finally, you'll also want to look out for words appearing as frames around the magic square, or crosses intersecting in the center. In the oldest Abrumlin manuscripts we know of today, the magic squares are primarily made up of Hebrew words written in the Latin alphabet, according to their German pronunciation. For example, in the square to appear old, we find the word zaken, the Hebrew word for of old age. Similarly, the magical square used to fly in the air in the form of an eagle contains the word halop, which means to travel in Hebrew. But things may still be even more complex. This is because Hebrew is an alphanumeric alphabet, which means that each letter is also a number. What's important to note here is that even though the oldest manuscripts we've found are written in German, it's largely believed that this grimoire was originally written in Hebrew. If that's true, it's likely that the ancient Kabbalistic practice of gematria was used when creating these magical squares. Gematria is when an alphanumeric cipher is used to assign a numerical value to a word. Therefore, through a series of rather complex mathematical calculations, extensive messages and meanings can be encoded, and of course, decoded within what appears to be just a single word. In general, though, the positions of the words and the way that they're joined to one another can also form hidden messages, so we should always be paying close attention. One shouldn't be discouraged by the puzzle's complexity, though, because of one final thing to keep in mind. The true invocation of a magic square's power comes not only from solving it, but perhaps mostly from the act itself, which requires the magician to apply intense concentration and carefully direct their focus on the magic square and its contents. At this point, we've covered the majority of the grimoire's content and the powerful Kabbalistic magic it supposedly holds. However, with magic apparently so powerful, we have to wonder what people throughout its hundreds of years of existence actually attempted the ritual, and who might have completed it and harnessed the truly awesome powers of their holy guardian angel and the 12 kings and dukes of hell. And what about those who failed? A large part of why this grimoire is so famous is due to the ominous history surrounding it. There was, in fact, a man who famously failed the ritual, abandoning it in the midst of summoning the 12 kings and dukes of hell, no less. And his name was Aleister Crowley. The year is 1901, and the location, Scotland. A midnight storm is billowing, spraying heavy rain into a thick, dark mist. A historic manor sits on the edge of the Loch Ness Lake, and a man in dark robes steps outside, into the wind and rain. With a wand in his hand, he points at the electrified clouds above, shouting and challenging the dark powers that he'd just summoned. fearless and possibly frenzied on some alchemical mix of psychoactive drugs. This magician was the infamous occultist, Aleister Crowley. 2 years prior, Crowley had bought this manor, Boleskine House, for the exact purpose of carrying out the Abrumlin operation. As described in his book, The Equinox of the Gods, quote, "The aspirant must have a house secure from observation and interference. In this house must be an oratory with a window to the east and a door to the north, opening upon a terrace, at the end of which must be a lodge. The terrace and lodge must be strewn with fine sand." End quote. Thus, Crowley believed Boleskine House was an ideal location for everything demanded by the ritual. Understanding the complexity it required, as well as the dangers it posed, he was nonetheless determined to be the first person in centuries to complete the ritual in its entirety, because he was a true believer in its power. Aleister Crowley was part of the occult secret society known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and the member who originally inducted him into the society, the chemist George Cecil Jones, was actually the same person who first introduced Crowley to the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage. And it's safe to say that he absolutely believed in the grimoire's authenticity. He latched onto his pages, and it can be argued that Abrumlin's system of magic formed the basis of his own. Then just a young man, Crowley's enthusiasm for the grimoire actually led to the founder and leader of the Golden Dawn, Samuel Mathers, producing the first English translation. But that's a story we'll be getting into a bit later. Crowley indeed began the lengthy ritual process, though it's widely believed he took some major liberties in the requirements he followed. He wasn't exactly a pious or humble man, as made obvious by his legacy as a hero of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era. And he definitely loved sex and drugs. However, in his own descriptions of the ritual, he did rightfully acknowledge that the practitioner must seclude themselves and devote themselves almost entirely to prayer. Regardless, to what extent he followed Abraham's instructions is unknown. One of the major problems, though, that Crowley was entirely unaware of was that the particular Abrumlin manuscript he was following was fundamentally flawed. It suggested a total of 6 months rather than 18 months. Regardless, this problem wouldn't really matter in the end, because his attempt at the operation came to a sudden halt just 3 months in. Now, the actual events surrounding his abandonment of the ritual aren't entirely known, but the reason is assumed to have been due to a schism within the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and a power struggle against its then leader, Samuel Mathers. Since Crowley and Mathers had become close over the previous few years, it's assumed that Mathers somehow contacted him, despite the shield of solitude the young occultist had tried to establish at Boleskine House. So Crowley did what Abraham of Worms gravely warned against. Quote, "The operation is an irrevocable act." End quote. Putting his efforts on pause, Aleister Crowley left Scotland and returned to London to take Mathers' side in the schism. But the question remains as to why he left so hurriedly, knowing full well that those 3 months he spent might very well be in vain. People, of course, have their speculations. Rumors have it that he may have been losing faith, or that he discovered some fatal flaw in the instructions, as is a fact that the manuscript was genuinely faulty and even incomplete, which would be confirmed many decades later. However, Crowley admitted that his experiments at Boleskine House had, quote, "simply gotten out of hand," end quote, without specifying further details. So that begs a question. Might something have gone wrong during the demon summoning ritual? The most popular theory of them all is that he was in the middle of the 12 Kings and Dukes of Hell portion when he abandoned the operation, and thus the demons he summoned were never properly enslaved, and the portal to hell he opened was left unclosed. That might explain the strange happenings and multiple gruesome deaths that would later occur at Boleskine House and on the property, which I discussed in a bit more detail in my other video, The Curse of Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin's guitarist Jimmy Page would later buy the house, and in a 1975 interview with Rolling Stone, after discussing the bad vibes and hauntings that led him to sell it just a few years later, Page stated, quote, "Yes, it was owned by Aleister Crowley. After Crowley, there have been people carted off to mental hospitals." End quote. On top of all that, Boleskine House burned down twice, once in 2015 and again in 2019, and the causes of both fires remain unknown. Crowley himself seemed to be affected too, as he would later face a number of serious challenges, from poor finances to legal issues. And at the end of his life, he died miserable and alone as an addict. However, this is all assuming that he did indeed break the operation in the middle of summoning the 12 kings and dukes, even though his flawed Abrumlin manuscript didn't specify 18 months of solitude, but a comparatively shorter 6 months. He still wouldn't have reached the demon summoning stage just 3 months in, unless he went ahead and skipped a few steps. That is in line with his personality, though. In fact, when he eventually made a second attempt at the ritual a few years later, he wouldn't just skip a few steps, he would alter it almost completely. In 1906, Aleister Crowley, his wife Rose Kelly, and their infant daughter were traveling through China, and it was during this trip that he decided to alter the Abrumlin operation so he could perform it before they left the country. Among many other changes, Crowley's new version was not only dramatically shorter, but allowed the use of hashish. The result was apparently a success. Upon the operation's completion, he reported the manifestation of a shining figure who claimed to be from a mysterious magical order known only as the AA, and this apparition invited Crowley to become an initiate, to which he gladly accepted. And just days later, he experienced an even more intense mystical event, which he believed to be the first true meeting with his holy guardian angel. And during this, the Greek term agoades, which means body of light, came into his thoughts, so he adopted Agoades as the name of his guardian angel. Crowley's belief was that the Abrumlin operation not only could be altered, but probably should be, as each person is a unique individual. He wrote, quote, "It is impossible to lay down precise rules by which a man may attain to the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, for that is the particular secret of each of us, a secret not to be told or even divined by any other, whatever his grade." End quote. Crowley's success with the sacred magic would ultimately lead to the foundational practices and beliefs of Thelema, the occult religion he would found around this time. In Thelema, the summoning of one's guardian angel was absolutely paramount. He would emphasize to his followers, quote, "It should never be forgotten for a single moment that the central and essential work of the magician is the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel." End quote. And from the Book of the Sacred Magic, he took great inspiration when defining Thelema's basic rituals of protection, purification, evocation, and vestments, as well as countless other concepts in Thelema's magical system. Generally speaking, the immense infamy Crowley achieved is the main reason why the grimoire became so well known. In fact, the legend of his failed ritual at Boleskine House is still widely talked about to this day. But there is one other man that we must give serious credit to, and that is the British occultist Samuel Mathers, the founder of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In 1897, Mathers translated the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage into English, and integrated many of his concepts into the Golden Dawn's rituals and studies. Also note that Aleister Crowley performed his ritual according to Mathers' translation of the grimoire, the same which I personally own a copy of. So, if it weren't for his translation, it's unlikely that any of us would have heard of this grimoire in the first place. However, there's a bit of irony here, because all modern scholars and occultists agree that Samuel Mathers' translation is not only flawed in a number of fundamental ways, but it's missing an entire section, the second book out of a total of 4. We know all this because a number of older manuscripts were found in the time since Mathers' translation, and all of them contain this additional book. Georg Dean, the author of the grimoire's most modern and accurate translation, went out of his way to say that Mather's work was flawless. The problem was the manuscript he used. Some have blamed Mathers for picking the least reliable manuscript due to trust issues, and others have defended him, saying that it was the best manuscript known and available at that time. Either way, Mathers unfortunately translated from a French manuscript dating to the 18th century, which itself was a translation from an older German copy, and not a very good one. There are 4 main problems with Mather's version. The first is the duration of the Abrumlin operation, which he gives as 6 months. All other Abrumlin manuscripts specify 18 months. And there are more details added that make these 18 months even more complex, if the operation wasn't already challenging enough. The second problem is that his Abrumlin oil recipe was incorrect. The German manuscripts, which are the oldest and most authoritative, present a recipe almost identical to the one described in the Bible for holy anointing oil. Mather's version replaces the herb calamus with galangal and forgets the spice cassia entirely. The third problem is that the German manuscripts have 251 magic squares, and Mather's version only has 242. Worse yet, 2/3 of Mather's squares are not completely filled in, and many of those that are filled in are painfully incorrect, with words that are misspelled and out of order, and in such disagreement with the other existing manuscripts that it really makes you wonder if the French translator needed a new pair of glasses. The fourth problem, and perhaps the most significant, is that Mather's version is missing an entire book. This missing book is meant to be book number 2, following right after the narrative of book 1. So what this additional section actually discusses is what Abraham calls the mixed Kabbalah, and this greatly clears up the differences between classical Kabbalah and Abrumlin sacred magic, and how the sacred magic fits in with the medieval systems of Jewish mysticism. The book also contains a host of magical recipes ranging from charms to folk medicines. Though the eventual discovery of older manuscripts would reveal the flaws in Samuel Mather's translation, it wouldn't be until nearly 100 years after his version that a more accurate English translation would be released. And the people responsible for this were Georg Dean and Stephen Gut. Working off of the 2 German manuscripts, which are the oldest known and most authoritative, Dean would translate them into modern German, publishing in 2001. He then teamed up with Gut, who translated it to English, publishing The Book of Abrumlin, a new translation in 2006. And if one were seriously consider carrying out the Abrumlin operation, this would be the version to rely on. Georg Dean, though, took his work a bit more than seriously. As a lifelong student of the occult, Dean actually went through the trouble of making a full-on pilgrimage to recreate Abraham's journey through the Middle East to Egypt. And on his way, he sought out evidence that the journey in Book 1 was not meant to be allegorical, but had actually occurred, and that the books contained in the grimoire were truly copied from a set of ancient texts gifted from an Egyptian hermit. Among other things, Dean did discover a number of striking connections between Abrumlin's magical system and historic Gnostic, Coptic, and Sufi sects that were local to the most likely site of the now lost Egyptian city of Iraqi. There he also discovered evidence of what he calls the cult of a nameless angel, which seemed to harbor obvious influences. Dean argued that the inclusion of these specific teachings, existing only in this area of Egypt in this particular point in time, would have never been possible if the author had not traveled there themselves, as described in the grimoire. This brings us to our final discussion, the true origins of the sacred magic. The origins of the Book of the Sacred Magic are convoluted and elusive. The year 1458 is written in the book, and the oldest known copy dates to 1608. It's common for grimoires to claim to be far older than they really are, but You'd think that if it was written in 1608, the author would have suggested it to be older than just 150 years. Then there's a question of whether it was originally written in Hebrew. Even though the use of Hebrew words in the magic squares suggests they may have been Hebrew in origin, ironically, the only known Hebrew version of the grimoire is an objectively bad translation. It also only contains the first of the 4 books. As for the author, the book suggests it was written by a Jewish Kabbalist living in the early Renaissance period. However, others have speculated that the author may have been a non-Jewish German with a sympathetic but incomplete understanding of Jewish mysticism. According to the Kabbalah scholar Gershom Scholem, quote, "It shows the partial influence of Jewish ideas, but does not have any strict parallel in Kabbalistic literature." End quote. The translator Georg Dean disagreed, though, and presented his own theories on who Abraham of Worms may have actually been. The true author and protagonist, he argued, was none other than the famous Maharil, aka Rabbi Yaakov Molin, a German Jewish Talmudist and an authority on Jewish religious law. Molin was extremely influential during this era, and known for his commentaries regarding strict daily customs derived from the Torah, which can easily be compared with the requirements stated for the Abrumlin operation. Historical accounts of Rabbi Molin are also very similar to details revealed about Abraham in the grimoire. Finally, Molin lived much of his life in Worms, Germany. He even died and was buried there. However, whether Rabbi Molin was Abraham of Worms is ultimately inconclusive. Georg Dean even traveled to the Holy Sand Cemetery in Worms to see if he could find real evidence, but turned up empty-handed. The likelihood is that we will never know for sure. But perhaps that's part of the joy of old grimoires like the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abrumlin the Mage, thanks to the mysteries they leave us to ponder on. Can a person really summon their guardian angel and the 12 kings and dukes of hell to align themselves with God and make the world a better place? Well, there's only one way to find out. But for now, I hope you enjoyed my investigation. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, definitely check out my other video, Demonology Explained in Obsessive Detail, where I go in depth on the occult knowledge and rituals involving demons. Or, if you're looking for more details on Boleskine House and Aleister Crowley, I highly recommend my musical documentary, The Curse of Led Zeppelin. Shout out to my patrons. I want to let you all know that I seriously appreciate your generous contribution, all of which is reinvested back into these videos. So, I have you all to thank for keeping things stable in the channel. And if you'd like to join in and support, and make my future videos even more ambitious, I've got links in the description where you can make a one-time donation or pledge monthly if you wish. I'm Mr. Mythos. You all are awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.